It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Hello, Irwin.
Now, Esperanza, there have been times, and we've touched on this so often in Our Hamptons podcast, it's no secret to our audience the deep respect we have for really those families, and we know who those families are. We can call them the founding families, the multi-generation families, whatever. But we have a special guest today that is definitely, she fits that bill, right?
Indeed. Very exciting.
I'm totally excited. So, you know something, Esperanza, without any further ado, I think we're going to bring her on right now. So, our Hamptons podcast audience, really a big greeting to Mary Foster Morgan. Mary, good morning.
Good morning, Irwin, and good morning, Esperanza. And so nice to be here and meet you.
Oh, welcome, please. We're so delighted.
We are delighted. And, you know, Esperanza, we should also say Mary Foster Morgan did a lot of the work for us, to be all candid. We're very honest with our audience, Mary. And she sent us something called The Tale of Two Houses, Sherrills or Parsons. Esperanza, that's royalty. Sherrills and Parsons. That is East End royalty. So, and we're going to get into that, but she just wrote this, the prose and the way she phrased this. A lot of times we create an outline. We tweaked maybe here or there, but man, Mary gave it to us. So we're really going to let Mary we're going to just have a great conversation and have Mary tell us the story. So Mary, specifically, before we get going, so our audience knows, you know, what your story is, tell us about your family lineage, Foster.
Sure, happy to. Well, I live in Orient. I was 20 years in Manhattan, and I moved to Orient about 25 years ago, and started delving into family history for myself and for my nieces and nephews, really. And, you know, there's a lot of East Hampton history in my family because, as you said, my mother is both a Sherrill and a Parsons. She was the East Hampton town historian. So we had a lot of great conversations about history and architecture because she was an architectural historian. And as I got into thinking about family history, I remembered my grandmother's stories about these two sister houses. She called them the Sherrills and the Parsons. And as you said, they're both founding families of East Hampton. And I'm really honored to be a descendant. And so it's kind of fun to remember grandma's stories and see if they're true or not true. Right. And, you know, what are the facts here?
Right. I mean, that's the beauty of oral histories, which we do so rely on because often they are more truthful than what has been written down, you know, but then you can verify by what has been recorded in writing. So I'm sure you've gone down that rabbit hole with much delight and thrill.
Yeah, deeds and documents, boy, they tell the story.
They definitely, and you know, Esperanza, the name, we should just touch on Mary's mom for a minute. The name Sherrill Foster, obviously, you know, doing a little research before this episode, I found a 2015 article in the East Hampton Star. Tom Toomey wrote a book called Revealing the Past. And the article touched on, and this is to Mary's point, how Sherrill Foster, really, in the architectural description she gave, the genealogy, and then also discussing the enslaved people of the East End, the topic we've gone down that road, Esperanza, and also about the farm workers and the farm work in the early 20th century. And it's going to be a great segue because obviously there was the dairy farm, which we're going to talk to Mary about. But I mean, Sherrill Foster was, you know, dare I say, Mary, she was ahead of her time. I mean, in terms of this, right?
Yeah, she seemed like another pioneer, frankly.
Yes,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I can agree with that. And I can tell you, she was both a historian and a modernist. And with her son, Jonathan Foster, they built one of the early passive solar houses in East Hampton in the late 1970s.
Wow.
Ah,
She
yes.
loved modern art and modern architecture, modern furniture,
Brilliant.
modern design.
Yeah. And I
Really,
mean,
architecture runs in the family, so it's
uh,
no surprise that we're talking about two houses, also the
That's
sister houses.
that's a
and
good point.
apparently so does the love of history, Esperanza.
Correct. Yes.
Hey, pretty strong gene pool in that family. Do you notice? Like, I mean, these people, they're really like all that in terms of this kind of thing. And boy, this community is the better for it. I will tell you that right now. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
really, thank you for that. But, Mary, I have to tell you, reading that story you sent us, the tale of two houses. Honestly, right from the beginning, we should really tell our audience this is a recognizable piece. The first house we're going to talk about, the Sherrill grandparents, if you will. Mary was really at the very beginning of Fireplace Road, 4 Fireplace Road, where North Main Street meets, right?
Correct.
Right. Okay. Now, Esperanza, and I really love this, the way she started this. She tells Mary of the last years of the dairy farm. Mary, you told us this story of how your grandfather, when he would drive down a gravel driveway of the summer people, how did that play out in terms
Oh,
of?
well, I just love visiting my grandparents in the summer, which is, when we visited. And he had an active dairy farm. I was young, 10 or so,
Right.
when the dairy farm was still active. Maybe he had a dozen cows, about 30 acres of pasture land, which I just liked looking at the cows and watching their interesting habits.
Right.
But I remember you could hear my grandpa in the morning around 4 a.m. or so, getting ready to go on his milk route. And one time, and it's so memorable, of course, he asked the three of us, my brother, my sister, and me, to join him and tag along in his truck, right? So he also said, "You have to whisper." Why, Grandpa? Because we're going to be going to houses of the summer people, and we can't wake anyone up.
Oh my
So
gosh.
we would drive to these houses, near the ocean, and he would stop and he would walk up the gravel driveways very quietly with his milk cartons and come back, and we were still whispering.
Oh my gosh. That is just
I
To
could
that.
show
just
you.
I mean, I could almost just feel like, those early mornings in summer where it might be a little misty, foggy, the
Yeah,
air smells like salt, and maybe
absolutely.
some strawberries in there. That's always my memory of
All
like June,
right.
July, June, July. I could just picture that and
Wow.
and sense it.
Yeah, I mean that was really,
And the
Mary.
crunching gravel.
That's right. That's it. The dew laden crunchy gravel, right? Where you get back
Correct.
in your truck and the bottom of the soles of your shoes are a little bit damp from it. Oh man,
Correct.
Mary. We always talk about transporting our audience to a time and place, right? And boy, that is. I'm transported right now, and obviously, so is Esperanza. And we did a story recently, Esperanza, about the dairy farms on Eastern
Yes.
Long Island, and we, spent a lot of time on the Sherrill property. So that property at one point was over 30 acres, you said. Am I right, Mary? So that was
Yeah,
where the cows were and
I think it
everything
was
else.
larger. I haven't really, documented exactly. It kind of got larger and smaller, larger and smaller. And it was the site of some Cheryl picnics when we would visit
Yes.
in the summertime. My grandmother would host the Cheryl picnics that are still ongoing today.
Oh my
And
Oh,
I just remember the whole backyard was a whirl with, aunts and uncles and cousins of all ages. And, everyone had the name Cheryl somehow in their name. And you didn't know who
Right.
anybody was, but there was great food. And my grandmother always made clam pie, which was my
yum.
favorite.
Oh wow. Wow. Now, this is an aside, and I have to ask this question because I've always been a little bit confused about it. Um, It's not on any outline. I don't mean to spring anything on you, but I know growing up in Queens, New York, there was a big street called Parsons Boulevard. Now, and I'm now that I have the opportunity to ask a Cheryl/Parsons this question, do you know if the Parsons family from that is potentially some kind of distant relative, Mary, or
Potentially, you know, I'm interested in there's a Sherrill, you know, Sherrill Road or Sherrill Lane in East Hampton, and
right?
I have a
Mhm.
I suspect that my great great uncle lived there, which is why it was called Sherrill Lane. And Parsons was kind of a big family, so it might have been the Parsons from Eastern Long Island,
Right.
or there might have been other Parsons coming through New England and into New York, or you know, it's
Right.
probably distant relatives.
Yes, that
Right,
would be
right.
my assumption. And again, like all of these, when we play connect the dots, with these, these family names, Millers, Bennetts, there's probably maybe they're not their cousins, but they're their cousins
Right.
somewhere,
Somewhere. Yeah.
down the line. But Mary, you talk about your grandmother's stories, and you sort of have started to you've been relaying them, and how the house was in the family for 5 generations, and according to you, 6 if we bring your mom into play. So it was 6 generations of this house, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
And if as a little girl, I was really interested in all the stories that had to do with women. So I
Right.
think the ones that stuck with me were the fact of the 2 sister houses, as she liked to call them. There was our house in her house, rather, the Sherrill house on Fireplace Road, the gateway to Springs.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yes.
there was the one on Main Street, which is near the Presbyterian Church,
Right.
Mhm.
where my Aunt Addie lived, who was probably in her 70s. She seemed so old to me. And but we did visit a couple times. And Grandma would walk us through the house, the farmhouse, and say, we know when the property was bought. It was bought by Lieutenant Abraham Sherrill when he was in the Revolutionary War, and he bought the property from the Conklins because there was the deed on the wall dated 1792. And then she would go on and say he resigned his commission in 1800 to come home and marry his childhood sweetheart, Anna
Mm.
Hunting. And
Ah,
of course, all these things stayed with me. And I was thinking back on, why it resonated so much. And it is kind of the story of women telling stories about from a woman's perspective. It was really interesting.
Yeah.
And then the story goes on, about living in that area and knowing that the Sherrills and the Parsons also lived on Main Street. So it's fascinating to me,
yeah,
like who lived in both those houses.
right. And
Right. Right.
Esperanza, this one theme that really seems to run through this storyline deeply, and this is a family of very strong women going back generations, right?
I
I mean,
agree. I
wow.
agree. As I said, I mean, with your mother being a pioneer, all of these people were pioneers, and I could just imagine the women and how strong they had to be
Yes.
to live here and make it work. It's
It's
incredible.
true. I hadn't thought of that, and it's quite a compliment, because a lot of the inheritance always goes through the firstborn son. So you're always kind of tracing like who owned what because the sons are always inheriting it. But I've discovered some interesting things when I did this research.
Yeah. And you know what else? Just touching on those names, and again, this is, for Esperanza and I, this is such an Our Hamptons podcast sweet spot. How not only was this house, Esperanza, 6 generations, it was purchased from a Conklin.
Right,
And
right.
then,
Yeah,
yeah,
which
right?
made me wonder, I mean, how, the transactions that would have occurred back in the day, but there is that Conklin house on Accabonac Road. And I wondered, so, how farms would sort
Hmm.
of land would change hands and be sold and bought back. And I'm assuming that this Conklin was related to the other Conklin of that Conklin house that's on Accabonac. I mean, I don't know. It just, it
And there was a
was such a,
Conklin on Wainscott Main Street too, right, Esperanza?
oh yeah,
Right.
absolutely. I mean, yes, yes. Yeah. I mean, the East Hampton migration to Wainscott is, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I'm looking into exactly who the Conklins were. The deed has actually both husband and wife signing it. So I'm sort of thinking that maybe his wife signed it with him because it was land that she inherited. So maybe it was her family's land before it became Conklin's. But anyway, they did live there. There was a house there.
Right.
And the historical research, it was like it from the 1680s. So when Abraham bought the property, he bought it with a house and a shop and a barn and 19 acres, which was adjacent to acreage that he already owned because he'd been given it from his own father.
Oh,
So it was the smart thing to do, to buy that acreage.
Of
and
course.
At the time, it was an active farming community. The Dominys had already been living there for a decade or so.
Esperanza, East Hampton real estate. Apparently always a good investment. even when the Sherrills and Fosters were doing these transactions. And, Mary, we also have to note the Sherrill house on Main Street by the Presbyterian Church. I mean, honestly, arguably one of the most beautiful houses
I agree.
on Main Street, East Hampton, which obviously is a mile plus of incredibly beautiful houses. But this house is just so gracious for our audience. This is on the south side of Main Street near the Presbyterian Church. This absolutely beautiful, a federal doorway. And Mary has an image of it. We'll post on our Instagram when this episode airs. But the description is even perfect, simple and elegant.
It
is.
And dare I add, Mary, timeless. Because
I agree.
is completely timeless. But Mary, you started to talk about the farm families, and I really want to continue in that vein because, again, this is a topic that resonates with us. As we said, we did a podcast on the Long Island dairy farms, particularly focusing on the ones in East Hampton. But you talk about how the active farm communities within that northern end of East Hampton. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, obviously, your grandparents were one of them.
Absolutely. And I know I was doing a little research because I was interested myself in this Abraham Sherrill. When he bought the property, were there farms? And there were. There were farms owned by the Osborns and the Hedges. And I know the Dominys, according to my grandmother's friend, Jeanette Rattray, who'd written the book on genealogies, she said that the Dominys had bought property there and created built a wind-powered sawmill. And that was around 1730. So they might have not moved there at that time, but maybe a decade later they moved into that area. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that they were living there in the 1740s, and then the two, Dominy Nathaniels, there's father and son. It was the father who everyone called the clockmaker. He's the one who added the woodworking shop and the clock shop. And that interested me because in my research, I realized that my great-grandfather, Abraham, who was in the Revolution, also that Nathaniel Dominy, the clockmaker, was in the Revolution. And I think they had a bond. As I can tell more about Abraham, as I did the research myself, it revealed to me that they had a bond of friendship and, also being veterans and also community-minded and farmers and friends.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And again, Esperanza, the Dominies, creating the engineering of these wind-driven. This was in the late 1700s. I mean,
yeah, they were machines. I mean, that's
literally that
yeah.
they created, and just again, we talk about the genetics of these families, and then of course you go down and Dominy, the Dominy clockmaker, the Dominy furniture. This almost has taken on mythic proportions on Eastern Long Island in what they were able to create, right, Mary?
Well, and beyond, let's not forget that whole collection. I mean, the workshop is reproduced or is represented at Winter Tour, and that's the home really of the Dominy um, uh, production. And
Absolutely. It's really worth a visit. It's incredible.
Yeah.
A collection of tools, and the workshop is there, and beautiful furniture and a beautiful story.
Yeah. And
Um,
so I was just going to say, unfortunately, we do have the now reconstructed Dominy workshop on North Main Street. And thankfully, I mean, the houses that that pertain to your family, these two sister houses, also remain. One, obviously, because it's in the East Hampton Historic District, in the Village Historic District, fortunately. The other one, I would
it-
say, just out of sheer luck.
well, it is on the National Register of Historic Places because my mom realized architecturally it's an important Greek revival, home, one of the few in East Hampton, but more in Sag Harbor. And I wanted to mention about the Dominy windmills. My mother, one of my projects is to publish her master's thesis on molinology, where she writes about the building of the 1805 Dominy windmill, the hook mill, and what she had researched, who worked on it, where the lumber was from, which of course ends up being Gardiner's Island, and also the fact that the Dominys were extremely inventive engineers, and they created an unusual style cap, which she calls it looks like a little bit like a boat. It's a special, no other cap on any windmill in Europe or New England has that same cap. It's a Dominy cap.
It's so interesting because not only then what I'm hearing you say is they were not only very inventive in engineering wise, but design wise.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Architecturally.
And innovative, like really some significant outside the box thinking too. Just
Yeah.
wow. I
Oh,
mean,
that's wonderful that you are going to bring that into into the public realm, Mary, because that's such an important story. I wonder in your mother's research, and I think you sort of touched on it before, that I'm thinking that she found and highlights the many hands, and if you will, call them the invisible hands that helped to build all of, many of these homes even, but for the Dominies in particular, because this was so close to Freetown, and that is where your family's farm was also.
Yes, I think Freetown actually gets established a little later, so that if there were any uh, enslaved people, or there were a lot of people called bound boys who were, I forget what the term is in British history, but where you were paid, you were sort of apprenticed, I guess I would say, to someone, and you were paid something, or you stayed with them until you were 16 or 18,
Right,
whatever the
right.
age
Yeah,
was.
that was sort of the gradual emancipation in the late 18th century. So I think Freetown dates to around that time,
Yeah,
mid to
more
late
that
18th.
time, yeah.
Mhm.
But
yeah.
there were a lot of interesting people who worked with the Dominies on these windmills, and I'm as I look into my mother's research, I'm going to learn more about it.
Oh, I'll look forward
That would
to
be,
hearing that. Yeah.
that would be fantastic.
And I'm curious as to your childhood memories and summers, as to what people were there on your grandfather's farm.
Well, his dairy farms, there were only a dozen cows when I was a little girl. So he had condensed it pretty much. I think he was, realizing the writings on the wall that, there's the milk industry is much more industrial rather than small farm. And he was getting older, and his own son wanted to be a fisherman. So it's in the blood. And so he was winding down. I remember that, I like, enjoying looking at the cows and helping him if bringing the cows in at night. But there wasn't really nobody was really, a crew came in once a week or once a day, maybe it was, to milk the cows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they seemed to be professionals. I mean, knew what they were doing. Wasn't like it was that he had a group of people who were local that came over. It was sort of, they came in with trucks, and
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
it was
I mean,
it was this, late 60s.
yeah. I
So
mean,
sort of the early industrialization in a way of a small farm.
and in
Yeah.
a sense, the timing was almost fortuitous because as Mary's bringing out, her grandfather at this point was getting older. Was
Hmm.
probably and again, to his credit, I mean, the dairy farming was in his blood. I assume he did it his entire life, but he saw not only the changes within the community, but the industry changes. All of a sudden, something called Big Ag was just in its infancy, I guess, at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah.
And,
Exactly.
the family farm, wow, that is just really fascinating stuff. Mary, bringing it more into somewhat present day now. You were born, yeah, as you mentioned, bred in East Hampton, etc. Now you're living on the North Fork. Um, I mean, do you still feel the same? There's still obviously a lot of Fosters and Sherrills on the East End of Long Island. I should preface it by that. Am I correct? They're state
You are
families,
correct, and there's still that Sherrill picnic,
right?
which actually the Fosters are. I'm not directly related to the Fosters of Eastern Long Island
Okay,
through the Fosters. I'm related to them through the Parsons.
okay,
Ah,
The Foster comes from my father's side of the family, of course, which also early family. They made their way to Western New York, which was the Wild West then. So I grew up in Western New York
right,
along the Lake Erie shore, but we summered visiting my grandparents, which is
okay.
why I think perhaps I have such vivid memories, because it was really, when you visit somewhere, everything's new. And I wanted to relate to you my story about the two sister houses, in the sense
Yes,
that, um, as I'm learning about these houses, I'm remembering, Grandma used to say that her great great grandfather, John Parsons, because she was a Parsons, right?
right.
Left East Hampton with his older brother Seth, and they wanted to go to. They built into the Springs. They built at Fireplace, she would say, and we would ask her, well, why did they leave? When now we're talking in the 1720s or 30s, and she would say because East Hampton was getting too crowded for them. And
Oh my
it's such
gosh.
a kind of an interesting way of putting it, but you didn't question Grandma. You just did not question her. What do you mean by that? But as it turns out, so the oldest son, Seth, right?
Right.
He ends up inheriting the house in on Main Street. So as I'm doing my research, I'm realizing that the house on Main Street that we all call the Sherrill House was really the Parsons house.
Parsons House.
Wow.
It was in
Mm.
my grandmother's family for the 4 generations from the first Samuel Parsons, and then
Wow.
passed down through 4 sons to that fellow Seth, right? And Seth, the other part about Seth is that he dies in his 50s, and he gives his house to his youngest sister, Pua. And of course, I love the name Pua Parsons. And I would say, Grandma, how do you know? She said, I have Seth's will, right? Oh, and she would say he gave it to his darling sister Pua, which kind of sticks with you. So, of course, I had to do the research to find out if that was true or not. And what I found out was that it's true. The house was given by Seth, who inherited it, to his younger sister Pua. She was married at the time, about a year into her marriage. Her mother had been living there. Their mother had just died. The fellow that she married was named Recompense Sherrill, and the deed, it was a deed of gift that Seth gave to how he transferred the house to his sister. It was not a will, and it was made 11 years before Seth died.
Wow.
So the deed of
Wow.
gift says, I'm just looking up what something about to his not to his darling sister Pua, but to with fondness for consideration of great love and affection that I have for my sister and my brother.
Wow. Wow.
That's a lovely kind of sentiment. And no money changed hands, but it's interesting that Pua couldn't receive the house being married, because the colonial laws based on British law were that if you were married, a married woman, you had to have ownership with your husband.
Yeah.
So the deed is made out to both Pua and Recompense.
Wow.
But Pua ends up living there her entire life and ends up passing the house on to her oldest son.
You know, one takeaway for me here, Esperanza, on that story was not only were the women progressive in their thinking, so were the men. I
So
mean,
were the
like that,
men
that was
too. Yeah.
unheard of,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Am I right, Mary? Like
Yeah.
someone
Yeah. Well,
unheard of at that
that's
era.
what's so charming about the stories, the way I remember them, and finding out that they're true or close to true, because I'm still on the hunt for where Grandma quoted that darling Sister Pua. I think it must have been in a letter or something, so I'm on the hunt for that. But yeah, they recognized, women were people.
Yes.
Right.
And
Right.
respected, and
In a
you know,
time when you couldn't take that for granted,
well, yeah,
really, I mean,
exactly.
which is really terrific.
Well, I always have found that the people that came here were rather unconventional, and
Yes.
that seems to be expressed by the story that you just told. So,
We've
and
spoken,
unconventional in the most positive of
yeah,
ways. Yeah.
Esperanza, we've spoken about that on many
Yeah.
an Our Hamptons podcast episode, as a matter of fact, right? Like how
Mhm.
even like well, be it the artist, the right, whatever group you want to talk about, right down to the fisherman having a drink at the bar with Pollock. Like there was no
No
boundaries.
convention.
No,
Yeah, the
right.
conventions were, yeah, they weren't tied to convention necessarily. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's not always the case, but I'm not generalizing, but it seems like there's
Yeah.
something to that
I,
Well, that's
bonic blood.
right.
and also the earlier, times that I'm researching, they were, I mean, this fellow, Abraham Sherrill, fought in the Revolution. So he fought for, the whole concept. I was talking to my husband, he said they went from king's subjects to American citizens. So
Wow.
he lived
Yeah.
in that transference of,
Right.
uh, your own identity. You're no
Yeah.
longer a subject.
Yeah.
Maybe there's new ways of looking at things and new ways of doing things. You're now a citizen. You value self-government. You value land ownership, which is really, I think, was a huge draw to bring people to Eastern Long Island. And not so much, and everyone tells the story, it's all religious freedom. It was freedom. Religion was one of the freedoms,
Right.
but
Right.
freedom to own land and freedom to, pass some property on to your younger sister.
Right. Right.
Right.
It's a
Right.
really important point to make, and that's really so true. You know, we're going to start to wrap up, Mary, but just bringing the story into a little bit um, of the present day. Now, again, you live in Orient now. How connected do you still feel? Again, Esperanza and I have always had this conversation. Those childhood memories tend to be so much stronger than the memories we have as we get older. They really resonate so deeply. Um, Esperanza's heard me say this a million times. She'll probably roll her eyes. I remember baseball statistics when I was 10 years old because that was so important to me at the time. But how connected do you still feel to the East Hampton community? Again, you verbalized how the Sherrill family picnics are still going on. Do you still feel that same strong connection that seems
You
so
know, it's
evident in your writing?
it's interesting. I did live in East Hampton during my college years and a little bit after that. But, living in Orient now, I go to the South Fork to visit, as it were. And I was thinking about that, like, where do I visit? I visit all the natural places that I used to go as a child, the beaches. I used to bike to Springs, so I loved driving down towards Fireplace. I loved going to Sammy's Beach, and my mother had researched that possibly was named after the first Samuel Sherrill.
Wow.
I love going to Three Mile Harbor where we used to sail, and places like that, and they haven't changed. So that's
Mm.
the memories are strong of driving down Church Street with my grandfather and asking him, why is it named Church Street? And he would say, Well, it's the street that we all use to go to church.
Wow.
Oh, okay. And the story of the two sister houses, I was fascinated when I began to realize that my great-grandfather, Abraham Sherrill, lived in the house on Main Street, which we now call the Sherrill House. He was a Parsons Sherrill. I think he thought of it as his mother's house. And I'm sure he thought of it as his great-grandfather Parsons' house. And then he also lived in the other Sherrill house because he bought the property and had the house. Actually, it turns out he had the Dominies renovate the house when he was newly married. And they have a stairway in the house that is still, it is still there, a beautiful winding stairway and very graceful, that the Dominies created for him. And
Wonderful.
I think of the house on Main Street as the Pua Parsons Sherrill House, and I'm going to talk to the East Hampton Historical Society about maybe changing its name, or at least putting an asterisk next to the word Sherrill House, because it's really the Pua Parsons Sherrill House.
Aha. So currently it's known as only the Sherrill House? Is that?
Yes.
Yes.
But since I've done this this research and I have documentation, I think I can make the case.
Yeah. Well, definitely talk to Hugh King.
A good friend of my mom's.
I'm sure. Yes,
Wow.
of course. Of course.
That was really Mary Foster Morgan. That is really I think I could speak for our Hamptons podcast audience, Esperanza. They're going to really take so much away from this episode, hearing these really very personal histories that Mary shared with us of her families, and again, Sherrills, Parsons, names that just resonate so deeply with us. And I guess we should also tell our audience that, is there a specific place, Mary, aside from Googling this, that they could find out further information about this if they're looking? I know you've put this out to the public. How could our audience, if they want to research this more, where would you direct them?
Well, the East Hampton Library is a font of wealth of information. But I have this, what is it, a 4-page document of my research. I'd be happy to share it with you, Irwin, or however, if you'd like that. And
when this episode airs, we'll definitely take you up on that and share it with our audience. We'll put a link up so they can access this, and on our website as well.
Yep.
Okay, Mary. Great. Wow.
Any final thoughts, Mary?
Yes.
I love it that you picked up on the fact that these women's stories were meaningful, because they were meaningful to me as a child, and they turned out to be true. And also, there are the stories that I think my grandmother liked telling, and the stories that I liked hearing about the childhood, coming back to marry your childhood sweetheart, and
right.
And the darling Pua receiving a house and all that. It's just really another way of looking at history through maybe how the women participated.
Yes. Yeah. Which takes me back to my earlier remark about how the importance of oral histories, and we wouldn't have that perspective if it weren't for them. So thank you to your grandmother.
Yeah. And thank you to you
and your mother,
and to Mary herself for continuing that legacy and really sharing these stories that hopefully will, they will outlive us all, and that's what's really important.
Certainly.
And Mary,
I hope so.
We hope so too. Mary Foster Morgan, thank you so much for being our guest on our Hamptons podcast.
Thank you. Totally enjoyed it, Irwin and Esperanza.
It was great. And Esperanza, as always, a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Irwin. Thank you, Mary. Until next time.
Until next time. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.